Less than 10% of Americans are legally allowed to leave the country without restrictions at any given time. And most people don't even realize it. One missed court date, one unpaid judgment, one flagged document, and suddenly your freedom to move is gone. Now here's the uncomfortable question. What happens when someone who has never lived under those limits suddenly might, when headlines hint that a former president's travel was questioned, delayed, or scrutinized? It doesn't matter yet whether every detail holds up. The reaction alone tells us something, because the real shock isn't a plane or a runway. It's the idea that mobility, one of the quiet superpowers of wealth and influence, may not be automatic this time. And if that privilege can even wobble at the top, it forces a much bigger conversation about power, accountability, and who the rules are actually built to bend for. Stay with me, because this story isn't about where someone tried to go. It's about what happens when the system stops looking away. This story feels huge, not because of what allegedly happened, but because of what it threatens to disrupt. A single moment, rumored, debated, still unfolding, managed to hijack the public imagination almost instantly, not because people care about airport logistics or legal paperwork, but because it touches something much deeper. The idea that power might finally meet resistance. When you hear whispers about delays, scrutiny, or limits placed on someone who has spent decades operating without visible boundaries, your brain flags it as abnormal. And that reaction is the story. We live in a system where restrictions are routine for ordinary people. Miss a payment, fall behind on paperwork, get pulled into a legal dispute, and your options shrink fast. But for people at the very top, those with money, influence, and name recognition, those same limits often feel theoretical, negotiable, optional. So when a situation even hints that the usual exemptions might not apply, it creates tension, not because justice has been served, but because the pattern might be cracking. That's why this moment feels bigger than the facts we currently have. It's not about guilt or innocence. It's not about cheering or condemning. It's about watching how institutions behave when tested by someone powerful enough to make them uncomfortable. Do they hesitate? Do they slow down? Or do they quietly enforce rules that most people never get to avoid? And here's the key thing to understand. Stories like this spread because people sense imbalance. They feel the gap between how the system treats them and how it treats those at the top. This moment sits right in that gap, and whether it fades or escalates, it exposes something real about how power actually works. And if you want to understand why this matters beyond headlines and politics, stay with me. And if you find this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe. It helps more people see past the spectacle and into the structure behind it. Any story involving powerful people and sudden restrictions is going to attract rumors first and clarity later. That's not a flaw in the system. It's a feature of how modern information spreads. A single claim gets posted, amplified, reacted to, and emotionally processed long before official confirmations ever appear, and when the subject is someone as polarizing and influential as a former president, the volume multiplies instantly. That's why the most important skill in moments like this isn't belief or disbelief. It's restraint. Right now, there's a critical distinction that often gets lost. So alleged does not mean imaginary, but it also does not mean proven. Early reports are often incomplete, exaggerated, or missing context. That doesn't make them useless. It means they should be treated as signals, not conclusions. Signals that something may be happening behind the scenes and that institutional processes, legal, administrative, or financial, might be intersecting in uncomfortable ways. The mistake many people make is thinking they have to choose between dismissing the story entirely or treating it as established fact. In reality, the most productive space is in the middle. You can acknowledge uncertainty while still asking meaningful questions. Why did this rumor resonate so quickly? Why does the idea of restricted movement feel so shocking in this case? And why are people so eager for confirmation or denial? Those questions matter because rumors don't spread randomly. They spread when they align with existing beliefs about power, privilege, and accountability. This story didn't go viral because of technical details. It went viral because it challenges a long-standing assumption that some people are always untouchable. Even if certain claims are later corrected or walked back, the underlying tension remains. Separating rumor from reality isn't about shutting down discussion. It's about keeping the focus where it belongs. On what this moment reveals about how the system operates when scrutiny finally turns upward, even briefly, travel restrictions trigger a strong emotional reaction because they touch a form of freedom most people assume is guaranteed until it isn't. The ability to leave, to cross borders, to relocate even temporarily feels like a basic right, but in reality, it's a privilege managed by documents, permissions, and compliance. For many people, that privilege is already fragile. Court orders, unpaid obligations, visa rules, or legal disputes can quietly limit movement long before anyone notices. What makes this situation feel different is not restriction itself, but who it appears to apply to. Mobility functions as a kind of invisible power. If you can move freely, you can buy time, you can change environments, you can wait out pressure somewhere more comfortable or strategic. For people with money and influence, mobility isn't just about vacations or convenience, it's an option set. It's flexibility when things get complicated. That's why even the suggestion of a pause, a review, or a raised eyebrow around travel feels destabilizing at the top. It interrupts the assumption that movement is automatic. For most people, movement is already constrained by reality. Jobs, family responsibilities, debt, and cost all limit where you can go and for how long. Add legal pressure, and those limits harden fast. Deadlines don't bend, permissions don't expand, but wealth changes that equation. It turns time into a negotiable resource and distance into a buffer. When that buffer looks thinner than expected, it signals a shift, small, maybe temporary, but noticeable. This is why the public reaction isn't really about planes or passports. It's about the idea that one of the last consistently protected advantages of power, freedom of movement, might not be absolute, even briefly, even symbolically. And when that possibility enters the conversation, it forces people to confront an uncomfortable truth. The rules have always existed. The difference is who usually gets to feel them. When people hear the phrase flight risk, they often imagine something dramatic, agents rushing in, last-second interventions, or someone trying to disappear overnight. In reality, flight risk is one of the least theatrical concepts in the legal system. It's a dry, bureaucratic calculation made long before anything reaches a runway. Courts and enforcement agencies aren't guessing about intentions. They're evaluating incentives, access, and options. At its core, flight risk is about capability, not character. The question isn't whether someone says they'll comply, it's whether they realistically could leave and stay gone if they chose to. That assessment looks at very practical factors: financial resources, access to transportation, international ties, and the ability to support life elsewhere. For most people, those factors are limited. Even if someone wanted to disappear, the barriers are high, money runs out, work obligations pull you back, legal consequences escalate quickly. But for people with significant wealth and global connections, the equation changes. Private travel, international assets, business relationships, and multiple residences expand the range of possible outcomes. That doesn't mean flight is likely. It means it's feasible, and feasibility is what institutions are required to consider. This is why flight risk determinations often feel unfair or unequal. The same rule applies to everyone, but it produces very different results depending on who you are. What's important to understand is that flight risk assessments aren't punishments. They're preventative. They exist to protect the integrity of legal proceedings, not to make a moral statement. Yet because wealth increases optionality, it also increases scrutiny. More resources mean more ways to avoid consequences, intentionally or otherwise. That's what makes this moment feel so jarring to people watching. And the concept itself is routine. What's unusual is seeing it even potentially applied to someone long perceived as operating beyond ordinary constraints. And that contrast exposes how differently the same legal framework can feel depending on where you sit within it. One of the least discussed advantages of wealth isn't luxury or comfort. It's time. Money has a unique ability to stretch timelines, soften deadlines, and slow down consequences. In legal and financial systems, time is often the most valuable resource, and those who can afford it gain an enormous strategic edge. This isn't about corruption or backroom deals. It's about access. Access to better lawyers, longer appeals, negotiated terms, and procedural complexity that most people never get to touch. For ordinary people, time works in the opposite direction. Miss a payment and penalties stack quickly. Ignore a notice and enforcement accelerates. Deadlines are rigid and consequences arrive fast. There's very little room to maneuver because survival itself demands immediate compliance. When pressure builds, it compounds. A single issue can spiral into job loss, housing insecurity, or damaged credit with remarkable speed. Wealth changes that dynamic by turning time into a buffer. Appeals can be filed. Bonds can be negotiated. Valuations can be disputed. Each delay preserves leverage and postpones finality. This is why high-profile cases often feel endless. It's not that the rules don't apply. It's that they unfold at a pace designed to protect assets and stability, not urgency. But delay only works as long as resources remain liquid and confidence hold. When courts demand large bonds, question asset values, or enforce tight timelines, they aren't just processing paperwork. They're testing whether the wealth being claimed actually exists in a usable form. Paper wealth built on branding or projected value behaves very differently from cash when deadlines harden. And that's why moments like this attract so much attention. They suggest a shift from infinite deferral to finite options, from control over timing to submission to it. And when time stops being an ally, even powerful people are forced to confront the same pressure most people live with constantly. The reality that systems don't pause forever, no matter how much influence you have. Some business empires are built on steady cash flow and conservative margins. Others are built on leverage, borrowing against future value, using reputation as collateral, and constantly refinancing confidence. When legal pressure enters that second kind of system, the effects are very different. The issue isn't just whether laws were broken. It's whether the underlying structure can survive scrutiny that demands immediacy instead of promises. Leverage-based models depend heavily on perception. Asset values are often projected, negotiated, or tied to branding rather than liquid cash. As long as confidence remains intact, lenders extend credit. Partners stay patient and timelines remain flexible. Legal challenges disrupt that balance. They force numbers onto paper. They require bonds, guarantees, and proof of access to funds. What once functioned on assumption now has to function on verification. This is why court-ordered bonds and asset examinations matter so much. They don't just secure potential judgments. They test whether wealth can be mobilized quickly. For people whose financial power exists largely in long-term holdings or reputational value, the test can be uncomfortable. Liquidity becomes the bottleneck, and when liquidity tightens, leverage loses its strength. Legal pressure also compresses time. Multiple cases, overlapping deadlines, and competing demands remove the luxury of handling challenges one at a time. Each new requirement reduces flexibility. Each enforced deadline limits the ability to delay, refinance, or reframe. What was once a controlled narrative becomes a logistical problem. This collision between law and leverage is rarely visible to the public. It usually unfolds quietly through filings, negotiations, and financial adjustments, but when it does surface, even indirectly, it reveals something important. Not all power is durable. Some of it only works in environments where scrutiny is slow and optional. When enforcement accelerates and assumptions are questioned, the gap between appearance and reality becomes harder to manage, and that gap is where real pressure begins to show. In systems built on confidence and momentum, perception can be as powerful as enforcement. That's why even the slightest hint of constraint can carry outsized consequences. No final ruling is required. No dramatic intervention needs to be confirmed. The suggestion alone that movement might be reviewed, delayed, or limited is enough to change how people assess risk, and risk, once reassessed, alters behavior quickly. For individuals whose influence depends on appearing unrestricted, constraint threatens more than convenience. It challenges the assumption of control. Investors, lenders, insurers, and partners don't wait for verdicts to adjust their exposure. They respond to uncertainty. When signals suggest that legal or administrative pressure is increasing, caution replaces confidence, terms tighten, reviews multiply, decisions slow down. None of this requires wrongdoing to be proven. It only requires doubt. This is especially true when reputation functions as a financial asset. Public figures whose wealth and power are closely tied to image are more vulnerable to perception shifts. Their leverage rests on the belief that they can always maneuver, always negotiate, always escape the worst outcomes. When that belief weakens even slightly, the structure supporting it begins to wobble. What makes this moment stand out is how unfamiliar that wobble feels at the highest levels. For most people, constraint is routine. Permissions are required, options are limited. Arrive without warning, but for those accustomed to operating with maximum flexibility, even temporary limits feel disruptive. They introduce friction into systems designed to minimize it. This is why the public reaction isn't about punishment or celebration. It's about recognition. Recognition that privilege relies on uninterrupted optionality, and that optionality depends on institutions choosing not to interfere. When interference becomes conceivable, the balance shifts. The hint of constraint signals that deference may be giving way to enforcement. And once that possibility enters the equation, everything downstream begins to feel less certain. When institutions encounter extraordinary power, they rarely respond the way people imagine. There are no dramatic showdowns, no public declarations, no sudden reversals. Instead, there is hesitation, careful language, internal reviews, layers of procedure designed to slow decisions down. This isn't weakness, it's caution. Agencies, courts, and regulators understand that every move they make when dealing with powerful figures will be scrutinized, challenged, and politicized. The pressure on institutions in moments like this is intense and asymmetrical. A single decision can trigger legal challenges, media backlash, or accusations of bias. That risk doesn't exist when enforcement targets ordinary people. For them, the system moves quickly and decisively because there's little reputational cost to doing so. But when the subject carries influence, institutions often shift from enforcement mode to defensive mode. This is where credibility is tested. Institutions are meant to apply rules consistently, regardless of who stands in front of them. Yet consistency becomes hardest to maintain precisely when it matters most. Every delay, exception, or procedural detour raises questions: are the rules being enforced or negotiated? Is caution protecting fairness or protecting power? At the same time, institutions aren't monoliths. They are made up of individuals navigating professional risk, legal obligations, and political pressure simultaneously. Choosing enforcement over deference can feel like stepping into a storm. Choosing delay can feel safer, even if it erodes public trust over time. That's why moments like this don't resolve cleanly. They unfold through incremental decisions, quiet approvals, and narrow interpretations of authority. The public often only sees fragments, but those fragments reveal a deeper struggle. Whether institutions exist to preserve stability at all costs or to enforce limits, even when doing so, is uncomfortable. The question isn't whether institutions have power, it's whether they are willing to use it when the consequences are no longer abstract and when blinking first might reshape how power itself is understood. Whenever high-profile legal trouble enters the conversation, the idea of a non-extradition country quickly follows. It's often framed like a secret escape hatch, as if certain places exist beyond the reach of law entirely. In reality, extradition doesn't work that way. It isn't a simple yes or no switch. It's a complex web of treaties, diplomacy, political incentives, and negotiation. And for most people, it's irrelevant because they'll never have the resources or circumstances to even consider it. For elites, however, extradition becomes part of a broader risk calculation. Not because escape is easy, but because options exist. Some countries cooperate quickly, others delay. Some respond differently depending on the individual, the charges, or the political climate. This uncertainty creates room to maneuver, and room to maneuver is itself a form of power. It allows time, it allows leverage, it allows negotiations to happen behind closed doors. What's important here is the mindset, not the destination. Powerful individuals facing legal pressure don't think in terms of innocence or guilt the way the public does. They think strategically. Where do processes move slowest? Where is enforcement weakest? Where do I retain the most control over outcomes? This isn't cynicism. It's how systems reward those with resources. For everyday people, none of this applies. Borders are fixed. Rules are immediate. There is no strategic geography. Legal exposure means compliance, not calculation. That contrast is what makes discussions of extradition feel so uncomfortable. They highlight how unevenly flexibility is distributed. This is why even rumors involving international movement trigger anxiety and fascination. They remind people that the system doesn't just operate through laws, but through access to time, to geography, and to negotiation. And when that access appears to be questioned or constrained, it disrupts a long-standing assumption about who gets to play by different rules. What gives this story its staying power isn't the individual at the center of it, it's how closely the underlying dynamics mirror everyday life for millions of people. Most viewers don't relate to private aircraft, international assets, or high-powered legal team, but they do understand pressure stacking up. They understand what it feels like when multiple obligations collide and there's no room left to maneuver. For ordinary people, accountability is rarely abstract. It shows up as a notice on the door, a frozen account, a suspended license, or a deadline that doesn't care about context when problems overlap, a missed paycheck meeting, a medical bill, a legal issue landing during a housing dispute. The system does slow down to accommodate. It accelerates, options narrow quickly, and mobility, both literal and financial, shrinks. That lived experience creates an intuitive reaction when people see even the possibility of similar constraints touching someone powerful. It feels familiar but inverted. The same mechanisms, deadlines, compliance, scrutiny that quietly govern everyday life suddenly appear on a much larger stage. The scale is different, but the logic is the same. Systems become unforgiving when margins disappear. This resonance is also about asymmetry. Most people never get to separate problems neatly. There's no buffer of time or capital to absorb mistakes or delays, yet they're constantly told that rules are neutral and outcomes are earned. Moments like this expose the gap between that promise and reality. They reveal how much flexibility exists at the top and how little exists everywhere else. That's why reactions are often emotional rather than analytical. People aren't responding to legal details. They're responding to recognition that the constraints they live with every day are real, structural, and usually invisible to those with power. And when those same constraints even briefly appear to travel upward, it forces a reckoning with how unevenly accountability has always been distributed. There's a crucial difference between accountability that looks meaningful and accountability that actually changes someone's life. Symbolic accountability is visible. It shows up in headlines, speculation, and public discussion. It creates the impression that rules are being applied. Lived accountability, on the other hand, is quiet and disruptive. It affects where you sleep, how you work, whether you can travel, and how stable your future feels. Most people are deeply familiar with the second kind. For everyday defendants, accountability arrives with little ambiguity. You're told what you can and cannot do, and the consequences of non-compliance are immediate. Miss a deadline and penalties follow. Violate a condition and enforcement escalates. There is rarely room for negotiation and almost no room for narrative control. The system doesn't pause to consider reputation or legacy. It moves forward because it's designed to. Symbolic accountability works differently. It creates friction without full force. It introduces review instead of restriction, discussion instead of orders, pauses instead of hard stop. From the outside, it can look like progress. From the inside, it often preserves comfort and control. No sudden loss of freedom, no immediate disruption to daily life, just uncertainty managed carefully. This gap matters because it shapes public trust. When people see powerful figures encountering only the lightest touch of enforcement, it reinforces the belief that consequences are negotiable if you have enough influence. Even when rules technically apply, the experience of those rules feels fundamentally different. That doesn't mean symbolic accountability is meaningless. It can signal a shift. It can create pressure. It can lead to real enforcement later, but it's important to name it for what it is, a preliminary stage, not a resolution, until accountability carries the same weight regardless of status. The divide between how the system looks and how it actually operates will remain impossible to ignore. Stories like this are often framed as if they affect only the individual at the center of the headline. In reality, legal and financial pressure rarely stops there. It spreads outward, touching people who had no role in creating the risk but are deeply exposed to its consequences. When someone with extensive business interests faces uncertainty, that uncertainty doesn't stay contained. It moves through contracts, payrolls, loans, and communities. Employees are often the first to feel it. Jobs tied to high-profile enterprises depend on stability at the top. Even if workers have no influence over legal strategy or financial decisions, when pressure increases, expansion slows, projects pause, and cost-cutting becomes more likely. Vendors and contractors face delayed payments or renegotiated terms. Local governments that rely on taxes and development tied to these businesses begin to worry about shortfalls. Financial institutions react as well. Lenders reassess exposure. Insurers revisit risk models. Investors adjust expectations. None of these reactions require a final judgment. They respond to uncertainty, not outcomes. So the mere possibility of disruption is enough to trigger caution. And that caution compounds. Each party acting to protect itself, adds another layer of pressure to everyone else in the system. This exposes a contradiction that rarely gets discussed. We're told that powerful figures create stability, jobs, and growth, but when those figures are built on leverage and confidence rather than resilience, instability flows downward quickly. The people with the least control over decisions often bear the most immediate impact. That's why accountability at the top is never just personal, it's structural. It tests how much risk has been concentrated and how widely that risk has been distributed. When the foundation shifts even slightly, the effects ripple outward, reminding us that power doesn't just protect those who hold it, it shapes the lives of everyone connected to it. When stories like this break, the loudest elements rise to the top first. Dramatic visuals, bold claims, and emotionally charged language dominate the conversation because they're easy to consume and easy to share. A pause plain or a question document becomes the focal point, even though those details are often the least important part of what's actually happening. Spectacle simplifies complexity, turning slow institutional processes into momentary drama. Structural reality works in the opposite direction. It's quiet, procedural, and intentionally slow. Real consequences emerge through filings, compliance reviews, bond requirements, and administrative decisions that rarely make headlines. So these mechanisms don't look dramatic, but they shape outcomes far more than any viral image ever could, while attention is pulled toward rumor and reaction. The machinery of enforcement does its work off camera. This imbalance creates confusion. People are left debating whether a specific moment happened instead of examining what the moment represents. Did something stop or not? Was a document flagged or reviewed? Those questions matter less than what triggered them. Structural change doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through pressure building in places most people never see. Spectacle also distorts expectations. It trains audiences to look for instant resolution, public confrontation, or clear villains. But systems don't operate that way. They move through ambiguity, negotiation, and incremental decisions. When change does happen, it often feels anticlimactic compared to the buildup. Understanding this difference matters because focusing only on spectacle leads to cynicism or distraction. Structural reality, by contrast, explains why power shifts are slow and why accountability, when it comes, rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. The real story isn't what grabs attention, it's what continues quietly after attention moves on. This moment isn't testing one person's resilience or reputation, it's testing the system itself. Specifically, it tests whether rules retain their force when applying them becomes uncomfortable. Systems are designed to look neutral on paper, but neutrality is hardest to maintain when power is involved. That's when exceptions are tempted, delays are justified, and enforcement becomes cautious. What's being tested is consistency. Do the same standards apply when the subject has influence, resources, and public visibility, or do procedures quietly bend to avoid conflict? These questions matter because systems don't fail all at once. They weaken through patterns, through small accommodations that become precedents. this moment also tests whether accountability is reactive or structural. Reactive accountability responds to pressure. And attention structural accountability operates regardless of who's watching. The difference between the two determines whether trust can exist at all. When enforcement only arrives after public outcry, it feels performative. When it arrives quietly and consistently, it feels legitimate. Finally, this moment tests how much patience the public has left. People are deeply familiar with how quickly rules apply to them. When they see hesitation at the top, it reinforces skepticism. But when they see even limited signs of consistency, it creates tension between cynicism and hope. The outcome matters less than the process, because the process reveals whether accountability is an exception or a rule that still holds under pressure. What matters now isn't how dramatic the headlines get or how quickly rumors are confirmed or corrected. What matters is what gets enforced, what gets delayed, and who feels the pressure when attention fades. Moments like this show us how power negotiates with accountability and whether the rules still hold when they stop being convenient. Keep watching the structure, not the spectacle. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, let me know in the comments what you think this moment really represents. And if you value clear, honest analysis like this, make sure to subscribe, because these systems affect all of us, whether we're in the headlines or not.